My name is John Harrington and I'm here to present the conference paper entitled Invertible, a lightweight, audit-optimized and flexible network security policy system. The hypothesis provided is that app designers can simply describe and store network flow requirements, allow the supporting infrastructure to change over the lifetime of the project, but the requirements still remain valid. That these flows can easily be compiled into desired and installed firewall rules, and that those rules can be easily traced back to the original requirements. The hypothesis we present is that enterprises undervalue simple network flow requirements. An app designer might describe the firewall rules she needs for her service in the format of precious 1 server needs to talk to favorite 2 server on port 8080. This is extremely useful syntax for firewall engineers. Those requirements would get put in a table in a Word doc, get approved, and then get installed on one or many firewalls. So what's the problem? Well, when the application designer specified individual servers in the requirement, effectively they have mandated which servers to use. And by specifying individual servers, it makes the rules quite fragile. Also, when those requirements are stored in documents, then that makes them practically inaccessible. And lastly, what happens 2 years later when someone looks at the firewall rule and says, what application does it belong to? In the absence of a proper store of requirements, it's very difficult to answer that question. The research method we followed was to model requirements through agile user stories so the practitioners could further and better engage with the work, to create proof of concept code to validate the hypothesis, use Python for rapid prototyping of that code, and use Jupyter notebooks to demonstrate the results. Let's look at some user stories. We have an app designer who asks questions such as, how can I describe my service? We have an app auditor who might ask, how can you secure that service or prove to me that it is secured? Show me all of the flows in that application. A systems engineer has different concerns, predominantly about scaling and supporting the service, changing workloads in a workload group, for example. And a firewall engineer or a firewall auditor may look at a firewall rule base and ask questions such as, explain why these rules are present and if any can be removed. Let's look at our code structure. We start with the concept of a workload group. This is an essential abstraction. It's a name for a group of workloads or servers. You might start your service with just a single server in a workload group, and that is absolutely fine. But the indirection provided by the workload group name is essential to the operation of the policy system. A workload group, when combined with a port, becomes a service, and you can receive traffic on that combination of the workload group and the port. And that overall, these are what makes up a flow. An application can have many flows. Flows can have one or many segments, and those segments eventually become connections. The connection is the lowest level representation of a flow, or what we call a connection here is one-to-one mapped with a firewall rule. A rule is specific to a device and pulled from the firewall configuration. A connection is what is expected to be present in that firewall. When an app designer cares about flows, they will describe the flow at a high level from workload group to service. A systems engineer is concerned about scale and maintenance, so they will care about which workload groups are in a workload group. They can swap them out, augment, supplement, or reduce if they wish. They can even insert a load balancer in the flow, and that will break the flow into multiple segments. This is because load balancers perform network address translation, and thus the IP address used would change from segment A to segment B. And last, we have a firewall auditor who is concerned with the individual workloads required. cannot look at workload groups, but needs to know individual connections. So remember, this is the lowest level representation in the model and is mapped one-to-one with a connection to a firewall rule. Okay, let's have a quick look at the code. I'm not going to show you all of the code required here, only to say that all of the code is provided and available. We can look at class definitions for workload groups, services, flows, segments, connections, and the firewalls themselves. That's all available for further request. What we can do though is look at the individual user stories and see what happens. Well, okay, let's look at some user stories. So an app designer might ask to describe the network flows for the Parrot application. This is done relatively simply. We're looking at a JSON input file here, and this is the way we're storing it on the file system. This is our requirement specification. An application specification is very simple, 4 lines, and for each flow in an application, it's another 4 lines. The app auditor will ask a slightly different question, such as show me how these flows are protected by the firewall rules. Before we look at the outputs, let's have a quick look at the code here. So to get all connections, we're looking at the connections class, and we're storing a connections dictionary there with all instances of the class. And we were just simply iterating through it and asking it a question, such as show me all of the connections. For firewall connections, each firewall can retrieve its own related connections. So we can ask it, tell me your expected connections, please, firewall 1. And then lastly, we can look at connections not protected. You see this is a fairly simple comprehension here, and it'll show me the connections from the connections list if you don't have an associated firewall. So we can see the outputs here for all connections, firewall 1 only, and the connections which are not protected, broken out here in a little bit more detail to explain why. And it's because these two, front end and back end, are in the same zone. The systems engineer will ask a slightly different question. It's like, what is the impact if I was to touch host1.example.com? By simply walking all of the related attributes of the workload group, of the host or the workload in the workload group, we can go, hey, you belong to workload group front end. You're already part of a flow, so we know it's going to be a firewall rule impact. If you want to have a chat about the service, chat to Ron. And lastly, there's a firewall rule auditor who wants to know questions about firewall 1. So we can look at firewall rules with a clear lineage. So these are firewall rules retrieved from the firewall, analyzed. A signature is computed from some of the data in the firewall rule, and then it's compared with a connection. Once we find the connection, we iterate through it, we ask for its lineage, and then we walk right back up through it, showing its name, its application, and its flow. And lastly, we might want to ask the question such as, find the rules that weren't provisioned through the invertible system and therefore do not have a lineage or a traceability. And we still retrieve them, so we should still report on them. So we can say this particular rule requires a manual audit. Okay, did we achieve our results? An app designer can simply describe and store their network flow requirements through the JSON syntax. The supporting infrastructure can change through the abstraction provided by the segment class and the workload group. Those flows can be easily compiled into rules. We just looked at that. And those rules through the signature can easily be traced back up through rule via signature to connection through segment, flow, and application. Further research we can do on this topic is, first of all, is loadable policy syntax. We can inject policy to the requirements, and such as all internet-bound flows must flow through a proxy. We can add graphs or GUIs like flows, segments, or connections. We can map those into dot format and easily graph them. And lastly, we can enhance the workflow. We could say if an app owner retires, then that app owner, the new app owner, becomes the owner's manager. Thank you very much for your time.